Donald Trump is reviving the President Biden pardon issue over his mental incapacity, citing the use of the Autopen as the reason to doubt the last-minute pardon signed off by the former president. He posted about it on Truth Social, saying, "The pardons that Sleepy Joe Biden gave to the unelect committee of political thugs and many others are hereby declared void, vacant, and of no further force or effect. Because of the fact that they were done by Autopen, in other words, Joe Biden did not sign them, but more importantly, he did not know anything about them. The necessary pardoning documents were not explained to or approved by Biden. He knew nothing about them, and the people that did may have committed a crime. Therefore, those on the Unselect Committee who destroyed and deleted all evidence obtained during their 2-year witch hunt of me and many other innocent people should fully understand that they are subject to investigation at the highest level. The fact is that they are probably responsible for the documents that were signed on their behalf without the knowledge or consent of the worst president in the history of our country, Crooked Joe Biden." Now, the New York Post wrote about this, saying that Biden preemptively pardoned all 9 members of the Jan 6 committee, including the 2 leaders, Representative Benny Thompson and then Representative Liz Cheney, a quasi-Republican who later pledged to vote for the then Vice President Kamala Harris in the 2025 election. Now, according to the New York Post, on the last day of his presidency, Biden issued a string of 11th-hour pardons, including preemptive pardons to former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, and Dr. Anthony Fauci. Milley has publicly called Trump a wannabe dictator and detailed his conduct around the, quote, deadly, end quote, January 6th attack during the House investigation. Meanwhile, Fauci, who served as Biden's chief medical advisor until his retirement in 2022, drew ire when he repeatedly dismissed the theory that the COVID-19 virus most likely leaked from a Chinese lab. My friends, that is not why people hate Dr. Fauci. Trump and the other Republicans have accused the 84-year-old doctor of lying to Congress on key aspects of his response to the pandemic. Dr. Fauci denied to Congress that when he was the head of the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, or the NIAID, the government funneled money to EcoHealth Alliance for gain-of-function research, which back in my medical news day, I interviewed a whistleblower at EcoHealth. Anyway, the New York Post writes, however, federal watchdog and congressional investigations found evidence of federal dollars going towards risky gain-of-function research at China's now infamous Wuhan Institute of Virology. Trump was outraged after Biden issued the preemptive pardons, blasting the move as disgraceful and saying many are guilty of major crimes. It is unclear whether any courts will take steps to void Biden's pardon over the Autopen claims. Last week, a Missouri Attorney General, Andrew Bailey, suggested that dozens of executive orders signed by former President Biden were authorized with identical Autopen signatures, and, quote, if true, these executive orders, pardons, and all other actions are unconstitutional and legally void. Bailey said, I am demanding that the DOJ investigate whether President Biden's cognitive decline allowed unelected staff to push through radical policy without his knowing approval. So, let's ask the real important question here. What is the actual legal standing for Donald Trump's claim? And could President Trump actually succeed? Well, there's a couple of big roadblocks here. The first is the U.S. Constitution grants the president broad pardon power under Article 2, Section 2. The president, quote, shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. This authority is sweeping and broad, and there are few explicit limits, and courts have historically been reluctant to interfere when it comes to the pardon process. Now, Trump mentions the Autopen signature and suggesting it is part of his idea on how to invalidate these pardons. Now, the key question here is if Biden was mentally not there, maybe they could use this as a way to invalidate his signatures. But the big problem I see to this is when it comes to trying to nullify the Autopen usage, presidents have been using Autopens for decades now to sign legislation, executive orders, and even pardons when they're unavailable to sign by hand. I'll give you a case in point. Back in 2005, the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel issued an opinion stating that a president does not need to physically sign a bill for it to become law. They just need to direct a subordinate to affix their signature, including via Autopen, to the bill. And back in 2011, Barack Obama used an Autopen to sign the Patriot Act extension. and it wasn't challenged successfully. So the mere use of an Autopen doesn't inherently void a pardon. So Trump would need to prove that the former President Biden didn't authorize the Autopen's use, which would then lead us to the mental capacity angle. And this is also going to be tricky for Trump. He would need to prove that Biden was so mentally incapacitated that he didn't know about or approve of these pardons. Essentially, he would need to prove that they were fraudulent acts by either aides or someone else within the White House. But this would be very difficult to overcome. The Constitution, you see, does not specify a mental fitness test for exercising the presidential powers. And the 25th Amendment only kicks in if the president is unable to discharge the powers and the duties of his office, a process requiring the vice president and the cabinet to intervene, which, of course, as we know, it never happened during Biden's term. And the thing is that trying to prove incapacity after the fact is really messy and difficult. Sure, we know President Biden was basically a half vegetable by the time his presidency came to an end, but how do you prove that he wasn't aware that pardons were being issued? And this is going to be the difficulty here. There's no legal standard for retroactively judging a president's mental fitness for past actions, and the Biden team would try to counter any arguments that he didn't know what was happening with evidence of his engagement, using speeches, meetings, and even pardon announcements as proof that Biden was all there. And they would try to argue that he was at least mentally aware enough to know what was happening. So it's going to be a very difficult hill for the Trump team to climb to void these pardons. So that takes me to my next thought process here. Surely President Trump knows all of this. He's not stupid by any stretch. So what is the real intent behind Trump's announcement? Yeah, there's the long shot that maybe they'll actually be able to overturn these pardons, but that can't possibly be the entire story here. So again, what is the real intent for Trump here? Well, aside from once again absorbing yet another news cycle by this attention-grabbing headline, investigating Biden's mental capacity during his presidency will be a solid political win. Not only was Biden essentially a half vegetable through much of his presidency, but these last-minute pardons themselves were a huge outrage for the American people. They were done after the election, and they were a clear slap in the face at the American people for not voting for the right candidate. And worse still, it was a further corruption of the rule of law. So whether Biden knew or not about these pardons, this really made the American people mad. Specifically, the J6th committee, who destroyed evidence that they collected during their investigation, leaving suspicious gaps in the public archive. And considering what we now know of the Fed's involvement on January 6th, the likelihood of criminal involvement by the FBI and other agencies seems high to me. So, probing Biden's mental capacity by President Trump and issuing this proclamation that Biden was mentally gone when these Autopen pardons were issued, he is unleashing a political battering ram. This isn't so much about the legal aspect of it, I think, as the political gain that he will get here. And doing this proclamation is likely going to force a much broader inquiry into Biden's mental state during his presidency. I mean, what better way to invalidate Joe Biden than to bring to light the blatant abuse of this elderly man who didn't know where he was half the time? Imagine what this will do to the public perception of Biden's administration. Imagine what this will do to the perception of his wife, Dr. Jill, who oversaw Biden's mental decline but helped hide it from the public. All Trump has to do here is lean on his Justice Department to launch an investigation into the pardon process. They could demand records. Who authorized the Autopen? Did Biden personally sign off of it, or was it delegated? Were there medical assessments of Biden's condition at the time? Sure, the 25th Amendment wasn't invoked, but Trump could argue that the aides hid Biden's decline, bypassing constitutional checks. He does not have to win here in court to have a huge political victory. Think of the massive headlines that this will generate, the potential for congressional hearings, keeping the broken Biden legacy in the public spotlight, while ripping and tearing it to shreds in the court of public opinion. But there's another angle here as well. This is an opportunity for Donald Trump, a golden opportunity to add more fuel to the fire of the long-standing claims that there is a deep state or a shadow government working behind the scenes. Trump's team will be looking for evidence to see who was really running the show, not just for these pardons, but this investigation would open up the entire presidency. If Trump is successful at convincing the public that the Autopen pardons were unauthorized by Biden and were in fact done so by somebody else, he's not just attacking President Biden and his pardons, but he is directly firing both barrels at this deep state within the government. Trump's post could very well be this signal to the DOJ and to the GOP-led committees to chase down this thread. And these investigation committees would be able to use subpoenas to get White House logs, emails, forced testimony from Biden-era staffers, and so on and so forth. All you would have to do would be uncover enough improprieties, say maybe a staffer admitting that Biden was out of it during a meeting, to help cement the idea that President Biden was just a puppet president. It is the ultimate fishing expedition for Donald Trump, and there is huge political payout at the end of this tunnel. So, while legally undoing the pardon seems like an extreme long shot to me, standing here on the sidelines looking in just as you are, politically, I think this will be a huge win for Donald Trump. It's going to keep his enemies on the defensive, and it will keep his supporters, his base, fired up. And at the very least, it's going to add chaos into the mix, which will help Donald Trump. Because believe you me, this kind of story is going to lock in the mainstream media into reporting on it, whether they want to or not. So I believe all of this is going to work to his advantage. But of course, we're just going to have to wait and see how all of it turns out. But I suppose only time will tell.